Welcome to the Training Expositors Podcast. This podcast exists to help the local church identify and train teachers at every level. I'm your host, Daniel Kurtz, and I'm excited you're here with us today. As we keep talking about raising up teachers in the church and what that looks like, raising up elders, raising up teachers, one of the things that we really need to talk about is the attitude that we have, or at least that we should have in the church towards growth, towards what it means to be raising up teachers, what it looks like to be raising up teachers. And so what I mean by an attitude or this outlook that we have toward things is the attitude that we have towards things like church planting or calling pastors and elders and raising up teachers in general. To put it in a little bit more simpler terms or whatever, this is the attitude that we have towards church growth. Church growth is something that gets talked about a whole lot, especially in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, you have people within the local church talking about wanting to grow the church or looking at different metrics to kind of determine what growth looks like. And often they're asking questions like, how many people are attending? How many members do we have? How many people are attending? How many people are on the rolls? How many baptisms are happening? How many people are coming to youth? And these can be important questions. They can be important for showing, are we actually reaching people the way that we should be? Are we actually sharing the gospel? Are we actually being evangelistic? And all of that is really important. There's a kind of opposite side to that, where if those numbers become kind of what we're looking at as church growth, or like the full measure of what church growth is, then we're missing something. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. On the other hand, when we talk about church growth, we can think about it, or we talk about it within the context of the church universal. So we talk about different people groups being reached, the number of missionaries we send out, number of churches that are getting planted, these kinds of things. And the point I want to make today about the attitude we have in churches, or that we should have in our churches, the point I want to make today is that these things are tied together, that the local church and church planting, the church universal kind of thoughts, there are things that are actually the responsibility of the local church. I think far too often, especially like in the Baptist world within the SBC and with the North American Mission Board being such a big thing, we kind of think of church planting as the responsibility of NAM, the responsibility of the SBC, and view it less as the responsibility of local churches. We think, we'll give our money to the cooperative program, and NAM's going to plant churches, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And we very rarely think about it like our church planting another church. Maybe we come alongside them, like the Pillar Network has been really big into that, coming alongside other churches and helping churches plant churches kind of deal. A lot more kind of grassroots movement, if you will. But the point I want to make today is that we need to, as churches, to have a goal of self-replication. And so if we're going to count numbers as a growth metric, some of those numbers that we need to look at or be thinking about is the number of teachers that we're training. How many teachers is your church training on a regular basis? How many people are being raised up as teachers? How many people do we have that are going into ministry? How many people, are being called as pastors or elders or deacons? The number of men that are being discipled and qualified to serve in those roles. How many people from our church end up going to seminary and coming back to our church or going to another church to help them? Those are part of the metric that we need to be looking at for what it means to have healthy church growth. And I think that there are a lot of churches that never really consider this or even think about this idea of self-replication. And it's pretty clear from the rise of churches moving into multi-services or even kind of multi-site churches that this idea of self-replication is not something that's really considered, that we as a church are going to go and plant another church. The multi-service thing ends up being, well, our church is growing in numbers, which is arguably a good thing. And so we need to provide space for them, for all of these people to come together. And then you end up with these, massive mega churches that have issues just kind of as a principle, but we can kind of talk about that a little bit later. But the multi-site thing being kind of an exaggerated look at this, where you have a church that, instead of replicating itself and planting another church, just we need to fit more people in for this one group, and so we plant a satellite over here that's not really a church. It's really part of this church over here. There's just the one group of elders, or even if there is a group of elders, it's the one main pastor, and we show it on a screen. And so there's an issue that we need to look at there about the attitude we have about what it looks like to have healthy growth. On the other side of the coin, you have smaller churches that never even consider this idea at all, that we never consider any of this. We look outside the church for someone to pastor. Like if you have a small community church, or a small rural church especially, which is the kind of church that I pastor, very few of the churches in this area that I'm in, these rural churches out here, have ever had somebody be raised up from within to be the pastor, to be the elder of the church. Most of them don't have a plurality of elders to start with, but very few of them have this, we're going to try and do our best to disciple in a way that we raise up these people from within. No, what happens is when the pastor moves on for whatever reason, whether he feels called to go somewhere else, or he becomes disqualified, or he gets too old, whatever the reason, immediately we put together the pulpit committee, and we're looking outside. We're advertising, we're hiring. And that can be a good thing. It can be a means, but if it's the only way we think about, we kind of have this problem here. All of this kind of comes in the context of this conversation about discipleship. Like, a lot of churches understand the need for discipleship, right? We're supposed to be teaching people and training people, but very rarely does this get taken to the extent, like, what are we actually looking at? What is the outcome of discipleship? What is the outcome that we should have? And if the outcome we are looking for is disciples making disciples, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot, we want to have disciples that make disciples, this kind of self-replicating process, right? That's the idea. Then there should be some amount of that, some amount of people coming out of that are becoming teachers, that are becoming missionaries, that are becoming pastors, deacon, elders, these things. And to be clear, we're not talking about a specific number for what we're looking at here. The point is that at the lack of, if that number is 0, that it should give us some pause about how we're discipling, what our focus in discipling is, what is our perspective towards evangelism and discipleship and these things. The Great Commission, which is, this command to go and disciple the nations, to make disciples, is to teach them to obey all that I've commanded, right? This is the responsibility to be self-replicating, right? It's given to all of us. It's given to the church to make disciples, to teach them to obey. And in order for that to happen, right, we have to have teachers. We have to have people that are discipled to the point where they can go and do that, to teach all of these things, right? So this is the idea we're talking about, the perspective of self-replication, that we have people that are trained and that we're raising up, that we're discipling to be disciple makers, to be teachers. Maybe that, some of those need to be a formal role of teaching. Some of those need to be elders. Some of those need to be pastors. Some of those need to be, deacons and stuff like that. And so we have to be constantly on this search for and training of teachers, right? Not everyone's going to become a teacher in the church, and there certainly shouldn't have everybody becoming a teacher, right? That, not everybody is called to that role, but there should be some amount of fruit in that area if we're discipling, if we're doing what we're commanded to do and to teach them to obey all that is commanding. We're discipling in a way that's self-replicating. There should be some amount of, there are teachers being raised up, there are elders and pastors being raised up within the church. And it can be really easy for us to get complacent, especially when it comes to like teaching in the church. We all have this, kind of idea that volunteers are, the thing that we're always looking for, especially like with kids or with youth, because nobody wants to work with kids or youth anymore, or ever really has. But we can get to this place of kind of complacency where you feel like everything's kind of just working pretty good. Like we have the teachers that we need, we have a good group of elders, we have a good pastor. And so, we're good. We're keeping the status quo. We want to keep moving forward. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what happens when something changes, right? What happens when one or several of the teachers in your church moves away, or something happens and they have to take a step back? Maybe they become disqualified for, sin in their lives that becomes apparent, or maybe they just need to spend time focusing on their family, and so they're going to take a step back from teaching for a little while, take a step back from being an elder for a little while. What if somebody gets sick on a Sunday morning and they can't show up? How do we deal with those situations if we're not constantly in this self-replication process? To look at it at a little bit wider lens, what happens if we need to plant a church? What if we're getting to that point where our congregation is starting to outgrow the facilities that we have, or more importantly, what if the number of people that we have as a part of our congregation is going beyond what the elders can effectively handle? Because we all have this, kind of like threshold for the number of people that you can effectively care for. Like, I think a good metric for this, it's not a hard and fast rule, like, once you get to 100 people per elder, then you need a new elder, and none of that. The kind of metric I'm talking about is when you get to the point where somebody goes missing from your congregation and you don't even notice. Like, it's been 6 weeks since I've seen so-and-so and nobody noticed. Like, that's the point where we need to make some changes. Maybe we need another elder, take care of things. Maybe if we already have, kind of a decent set of elders, and to, kind of add more would cause different complications. Well, now maybe it's time to plant a church, a sister church. And so we need to be ready for those things. We need to be looking ahead at these possibilities, even if we have these small churches that they've never been more than 100 people. We don't know how the Lord is going to work, and we need to be faithful to do all the things that He's commanded us to be disciple makers of disciples that make disciples, right? So another kind of issue we run into is, what happens if that person gets sick, we don't have a teacher to fill in? What do? Do we look outside the church, right? Do we depend on other churches to provide? I think this is a wonderful thing about being a part of an association, right? That churches work together, and if you have kind of an issue, you can call the association or call a sister church and get somebody to kind of come fill the role of the pulpit for that week. But those teachers have to come from somewhere, right? You have to have people that are able to do that. Like, you can't just be always the beneficiary of that. You need to be able to be the supplier of that at times. And so if we're going to be able to help the other churches around us and be able to have, backup people ready, people that we're training, people that we're preparing, like, this means constantly looking for and training new teachers. I think one of the things that I learned while I was in the Navy really kind of applies to this. The Navy has this really important thing about redundant training, right? What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go to the person who is above you and get that person to train you in how to do your job, how to do their job, right? So you're supposed to learn the job of the person above you, and then at the same time be training the people below you to do your job, so that there's this, double overlap of redundancy, so that if for whatever reason the person above you, in the context of the Navy, is if like we're in combat or something like that, and the ship gets hit and that person goes down, well then, the ship is not crippled in that area because somebody else can step right up and fill that role, right? And while we're not necessarily worried about being in combat in the sense of shells going off and torpedoes getting hit in the ship and stuff like that, in the church we are in this spiritual role of combat. And so this idea transitions pretty well to the role of the church. Are we, as a church, are we teaching and learning with the perspective that we need to be ready for anything? Are we going to the person who is above us? And if you're already the pastor or the elder of the church, I mean, you have other sources outside of your church that you need to be looking to. Like, you're not the end all be all kind of deal. This is why we read, we constantly study, we look at commentaries, we seek the advice of other brothers in the faith, to where we're constantly learning and constantly seeking to grow. But also, like, we're supposed to be training the people beneath us to take our role, to take our spots, to become what we are. And I think herein lies kind of part of the issue. Like, we can get in this mode of thinking that, oh, I'm the pastor of this church, and so it's all my responsibility, and I've got to do it. If I don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. Or like, if I start training my replacement, well, there goes my job security. Maybe the people will like him better. And nobody's accusing anybody of anything here, but that is definitely an attitude that we see in churches, because we see it just in people, and people are what the church is made up of. And so, are we training the people around us to take over if something happens? Are we ready to pick up for someone else who calls in sick, right? So if you are a leader in the church, either a pastor or an elder, what are you doing to train up and raise up somebody in the church to take your spot in the future? If you're not an elder in the church, what are you doing to kind of be prepared for that role? And this is what I want. This is the idea that I'm talking about with self-replication, where we have disciples that are making disciples, that we're looking towards the future. Are we training teachers to be ready to go, so that when we need a teacher, we have them? We've been providing them opportunities. We're not shoving somebody new into the role on at the last minute because so-and-so called in sick and we just really need somebody to teach Sunday school now or lead this small group. How are we preparing for that? Are we preparing for, to potentially plant the church? If our church began to grow so much that we couldn't care for that group adequately, would we be prepared to plant a church across the street or across town or whatever to reach the community better? These are the things we need to be looking at. If we make it a practice of seeking self-replication, all these issues will become much easier to deal with. And so my question for y'all, as y'all have listened to this, is what do you think about this? Does your church practice any kind of self-replication? Are y'all considering things like that? Like, what do you do if this week your pastor called in sick? Who's stepping up to fill that role? Is that person prepared adequately for that, or are they going to be terrified of that? If your Sunday school teacher calls in sick, is the pastor just automatically stepping in and filling all those roles? And that could be fine. But we need to be constantly searching for new teachers. And so if you wouldn't mind, you can go to our forum on our website at trainingexpositors.com and kind of just answer the question: how does your church practice self-replication. Or if you don't practice, self-replication, why not? Like, what issues do you see with the process? I hope y'all can contribute to the conversation, and I hope y'all have a blessed day in the Lord. I want to thank y'all for joining us today on the Training Expositors podcast. Again, you can engage with us on our website at www.trainingexpositors.com. We're also on Twitter. You can use our forum. We have blog posts that happen occasionally. And we just really would love to hear from you and see if this is helping you, if there's some things that you would like us to focus on, some things that you would like to hear more about. And we just want to really see this grow and help the local church. I hope you all have a wonderful and blessed day in the Lord.